What would you do if someone looked at your children and saw less than human? If a stranger's uniform gave them the power to humiliate and your babies, too young to understand hate, were forced to learn it midair? It was supposed to be a joyful day in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Marcus Reed, a widowed civil rights attorney, boarded a first-class flight with his 6-year-old triplets, Maya, Isla, and Aria, a promise to their late mother one day. You'll see the world she dreamed of. But somewhere between the gate and the sky, that promise shattered. When a flight attendant decided 3 little black girls didn't belong in first class, what happened next wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was a test of dignity, of power, and of what a father would do when the system that's supposed to serve you turns against your children. Would you stay calm or fight back? Would you choose rage or justice? Because Marcus did both, and by the time that plane touched down, an entire airline was about to face consequences it never saw coming. Stay with us, like, share, and subscribe, because this story will make you feel before it makes you think. The morning light spilled softly across the quiet streets of Charlotte, North Carolina, painting everything gold, inside a modest 2-story home at the edge of the city. Marcus Reed was already awake, not because of work, but because this was their day. The kitchen smelled like pancakes and maple syrup, and the sound of 3 little voices filled the house with a kind of music only a parent can understand. Maya, the oldest by 2 minutes, was at the counter arranging strawberries into a perfect heart shape. Isla, the thoughtful one, sat cross-legged on a stool, reading the safety booklet from a model airplane. And Aria, the joker of the trio, kept pretending to be a flight attendant, balancing a juice box on a tray and calling, "Sir, would you like peanuts or pretzels?" Marcus couldn't help but laugh a deep, weary, grateful laugh. These 3 girls were everything he had left. It had been 2 years since cancer took Naomi, his wife. She'd been the glue that held the world together, fierce, loving, and impossibly patient. Before she passed, she made Marcus promise one thing: don't let them see the world as cruel. Teach them that they belong anywhere their feet take them. And that's what today was about. A first-class trip, their first flight together since Naomi's funeral. It wasn't about luxury. It was about healing, about showing his daughters that life could still be beautiful, still kind. As Marcus flipped the pancakes, the girls argued about who would sit by the window. "You sat by the window last time," Maya declared. There wasn't a last time, Aria laughed. "That's true," Marcus smiled. "Today's the first of many." He wanted this morning to be perfect. He'd even polished their little travel backpacks the night before, each embroidered with their initials, each with a small photo of their mother tucked inside. A private charm against the world's ugliness. But beneath the warmth of that kitchen, something else stirred in Marcus, a quiet ache he couldn't quite shake. He'd been a civil rights lawyer for nearly 20 years. He'd seen too many headlines, too many courtroom apologies that came too late. He'd won dozens of discrimination cases, yet somehow every victory felt the same, temporary. Because for every one person he defended, there were 10 more who didn't have a voice, who didn't get a lawyer, who didn't get justice. He'd promised himself that his daughters wouldn't grow up knowing that silence, not if he could help it. Dad Isla's soft voice pulled him back. "Do you think Mom can see us from heaven?" Marcus paused, spatula in hand. "Yeah, baby, I think she can. And I think she's smiling 'cause she knows you're about to fly higher than she ever did." The girls giggled, and for a moment, the heaviness in his chest lifted. They finished breakfast and loaded the car. As the city skyline came into view, Marcus felt that familiar mix of pride and protectiveness that every black father knows. He'd worked his way up from nothing scholarships, night school, late nights writing briefs while holding a newborn in his arms. He knew how people looked at him in certain boardrooms, how their smiles stiffened when he walked in. But today wasn't about that. Today was about his girls. At the airport, the triplets held hands as they walked through the sliding glass doors, their matching braids bouncing in rhythm. People turned to look, some smiled, some didn't. Marcus noticed, but didn't comment. He'd learned long ago that the small moments of being othered were the first stones in a much larger wall. Still, he held his head high. They had first-class tickets in hand, not through luck, but through work. As they reached security, a TSA officer gave Marcus a longer look than usual. He handed over his ID, smiled politely, and waded through an unnecessary double-check. The girls were waved through quickly. "Routine?" the officer said. "Always is," Marcus replied quietly. On the other side, the girls ran toward a window where planes taxied under the morning sun. Marcus joined them, crouching down to their level. "See that one?" he pointed. "That's the one that's going to take us all the way to Los Angeles." L.A., Aria squealed. "Hollywood," Daddy Marcus grinned. "We'll see. But remember, this trip is our promise to Mom, to live brave, and to treat people with kindness, no matter what." The camera, if this were a film, would linger here on a father kneeling beside his daughters. Sunlight catching his wedding ring, a reflection of 3 small faces pressed against the glass. It's a moment that feels safe, warm, ordinary. But every story that matters starts this way, with a family believing in good before the world reminds them of its cruelty. As Marcus gathered their boarding passes, he thought again of Naomi's words, "Protect their dignity so they can learn to soar." He didn't know yet how soon he'd have to live that promise again. This was more than a flight. It was a test. Marcus didn't know he was about to face one that would challenge everything he believed about justice, restraint, and what it means to rise above hate. But for now, in that kitchen, in that airport, in that golden morning light, the Reeds were just a family about to take off. Together. As the plane tickets beeped through the scanner and the girls skipped ahead, Marcus Reed lingered for just a second, that heartbeat between past and present when a man takes stock of his life. He watched his daughters disappear through the gate, 3 little reflections of the woman he'd loved and lost. He smiled, but there was something behind it, not sadness exactly, but the quiet knowledge of how easily the world could turn cruel. Each of his daughters carried a piece of Naomi, and maybe that's why Marcus loved watching them so much. They weren't just reminders of what he'd lost, they were proof that she'd never really left. Maya, the eldest by a blink, had her mother's leadership in her blood. Even at 6, she had a way of taking charge without meaning to. "Dad says we board first," she'd announce, chin up, voice firm. She didn't know it yet, but she'd inherited Naomi's courage, that kind that comes from knowing your worth even when others try to strip it away. Isla, the middle child, was different, quiet, thoughtful, always a few steps behind, but never out of tune. She loved books, especially the ones her mother used to read, stories about pioneers, dreamers, people who built bridges instead of walls. She'd spend hours sketching airplanes in her notebook, whispering, "One day, I'll fly one of these." And Aria, the youngest, was the sunshine in their storm, always laughing, always teasing. The kind of child who could make grief pause for breath. She had Naomi's smile wide and disarming, the kind that made strangers soften for a moment. Before they left home that morning, each girl had taken something small from the wooden box Marcus kept in his nightstand, Naomi's keepsake box. Inside were the fragments of a life once whole, a wedding photo faded at the edges, a flight pin from Naomi's college days when she dreamed of being a pilot, and 3 silver bracelets she'd planned to give the girls when they turned 16. Marcus had let them wear those bracelets early. He told them it was for courage, but in truth, it was a shield, something to remind them who they were if the world ever tried to tell them otherwise. As they waited in the terminal, Marcus caught sight of the bracelets glinting under the morning light. For a moment, he saw Naomi's hand on theirs, steady, guiding. That's when it hit him again how close dignity and danger could sit side by side. Because Marcus knew the world didn't always see what he saw, bright little girls full of wonder. Some people saw only color. Some saw a threat in innocence. He'd known that truth since he was 10 years old. Back then, he'd been just another black kid on a school bus in Birmingham, clutching a science fair ribbon he was proud of. The bus driver told him to move to the back. He didn't. The ribbon was torn in half before he got home. His father had said, "Let it go. Son, some fights you can't win." But Marcus had never let it go. Not then. Not ever. Years later, in law school, he'd remembered that bus ride every time he opened a civil rights case file. Every insult, every microaggression, every slur turned into fuel. By the time he passed the bar, Marcus Reed had made himself a quiet promise he'd never lose a case rooted in prejudice. And he hadn't. Not one. He didn't win them all because of skill alone. He won because he understood the wound the way discrimination didn't just hurt. It hollowed. He'd spent years putting that hollow into words for judges and juries who had never felt it themselves. Still, there was one thing law books never taught him: how to prepare your own children for that same world. That's why he was always cautious. Why he watched the little details other parents might miss: the stares that lingered too long, the silences too sharp. Why he practiced kindness as a strategy, not just a virtue. It wasn't fear, it was armor. Sitting by the window, Marcus glanced at his reflection in the glass. The suit, the calm, the practiced smile. All of it was part of the armor he'd learned to wear in rooms where people doubted his place. He thought of Naomi again, her laugh, her strength, her faith in people even when they didn't deserve it. She used to say, "The real test of character isn't when people love you. It's when they insult you and you still choose grace." He hadn't always understood that, but after she was gone, those words became a compass. He leaned forward, watching as his daughters giggled over their juice boxes. If Naomi's death had left a hole, these girls filled it with light and purpose. He knew there would be moments when life would test them, too. When the world would try to make them smaller, when someone, maybe someone wearing a uniform or holding a title, would decide they didn't belong. And he knew his job wasn't just to protect them, it was to show them how to respond. That's why Marcus lived the way he did, why every courtroom victory mattered, why every quiet act of respect meant something, because dignity wasn't just something you demanded from others, it was something you modeled. He glanced at his watch. Flight 407. Boarding soon. He gathered their passports, double-checked the tickets, and felt that flicker of excitement again. Maybe today could be simple. "Maya," he called, "make sure your sisters stay close." "Okay." "Yes, sir," she said with mock seriousness, saluting him. Aria laughed so hard her bracelet jingled. Isla rolled her eyes but smiled. Marcus shook his head, pretending to be stern, but his heart was full. This was what he'd worked for. Not money, not recognition, just the right to raise his daughters in a world where they could laugh freely, travel freely, exist freely. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that the battle for that freedom wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. As he stood to join the boarding line, the gate agent scanned his ticket and frowned slightly, a tiny wrinkle of confusion Marcus had seen too many times before. "Looks like there's a small issue, sir. One moment." And in that small hesitation, that single, unnecessary pause, the perfect morning began to bend. Marcus glanced at his girls, already heading down the jet bridge, their laughter echoing. He smiled, waved, and told them he'd be right behind. He didn't know it yet, but that decision, that gentle wave, would be the start of something that would test every lesson Naomi ever taught him. The woman at the counter smiled, but not the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, just a small delay. "Mr. Reed," she said, "it'll only take a minute." Marcus nodded politely. Of course. He'd heard that tone before, careful, rehearsed, like someone reading a script designed to sound neutral. The same script that always started with "it's just procedure" and ended with a feeling that something unseen had been weighed and found wanting. Behind him, his daughter's laughter echoed faintly down the jet bridge. Their tiny suitcases rolled along the carpet like little drumbeats. Marcus watched until they disappeared around the corner, 3 specks of color swallowed by the white light of the boarding tunnel. And then, for the first time that morning, the air felt different. The agent excused herself and called someone over the radio. Marcus waited. A line began to form behind him, murmurs rising. He checked his watch, not because he was impatient, but because waiting always brought back memories of other lines, other inspections. When she finally returned, she handed him his boarding pass with an apologetic smile that felt more like a shield. "All set, Mr. Reed. Enjoy your flight." "Thank you," he said, his voice even. As he walked toward the gate, he felt the eyes not angry, not curious, just watching. It was a look he knew too well, the look that asked, "Do you belong here?" He did what he'd learned to do years ago, straighten his tie, hold his posture, let the moment pass. But even as he walked through the jet bridge, the thought stayed with him how small things can whisper before they shout. The terminal's first-class lounge was a world of calm and glass. Coffee machines hummed quietly. A string quartet played softly over the speakers. It should have felt peaceful. But for Marcus, peace was a luxury he'd never trusted completely. He spotted the girls sitting neatly on a leather sofa, their feet swinging above the floor. They were sharing a pack of cookies, giggling, whispering secrets only sisters understand. As he approached, a woman across from them, elegant, middle-aged, pearls at her neck, shifted in her seat. Her gaze lingered a second too long. Then, with slow deliberation, she reached for her purse and placed it on the opposite side of her body. It was a small gesture, quiet, but heavy. Marcus noticed because people like him always noticed. Maya looked up at him, confused. "Daddy, why did she move her bag?" He smiled gently, lowering his voice. "Maybe she just wanted to keep it closer, sweetheart." But inside, he felt that old sting, the one that no longer burned, but still cut deep. He knelt beside them. "How are we doing, ladies?" Good Arya grinned. "We're playing who can sit still the longest." "Then I'm losing already." Marcus chuckled, ruffling her curls. He tried to make the moment light, but the woman's eyes never softened. She turned a page in her magazine, her perfume sharp in the air, and Marcus thought, this is how it starts. Not with slurs or shouting, but with silence that speaks louder than words. Later, when the boarding announcement echoed through the lounge, Marcus gathered their things. The triplets hopped up, bracelets glinting, backpacks swinging. The same woman stood up too, walking just ahead of them. At the gate, she glanced over her shoulder once, twice, as if making sure they were behind her. Marcus pretended not to see. The girls didn't notice. They were too busy arguing over who'd spotted the plane first. "Look," Daddy Isla pointed. "That's ours." Marcus smiled. "That's right. Flight 447. He should have been thinking about seat numbers, snacks, the movie they'd watch on board, but instead His mind drifted back to that moment at the counter, the double check, the bag moved away, the looks. Little things, always little things. They gathered like dust, invisible, weightless, until one day you looked around and realized you couldn't breathe. He told himself not to dwell on it. He'd promised Naomi he wouldn't live in suspicion. He'd promised his girls the world was better than the stories on the news, but promises, he knew, didn't always hold up under pressure. At the gate, an attendant greeted the passengers, her voice cheerful and bright. "Good afternoon. Welcome aboard Flight 447 to Los Angeles." Marcus handed her his pass. She scanned it, frowned briefly, then smiled. "You're all set. Mr. B. Reed, your daughters are already seated up front. We'll close the cabin door shortly." He exhaled, relieved. Perfect. "Thank you." But as he turned toward the entrance, he heard her whisper something into her headset. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone, cautious, uncertain, was enough. He hesitated just a beat, the kind of pause you feel but don't understand until later. And yet, he smiled anyway, walking forward into the narrow tunnel of light that connected the terminal to the plane. Inside the aircraft, the air was cool and perfumed with coffee and new leather. Marcus spotted the triplets up ahead, sitting quietly in their first-class seats. Their feet dangled above the floor, their eyes wide with wonder. He almost laughed. They looked so small among all that luxury. Naomi would have teased him for worrying. He began moving down the aisle, but before he could reach them, a voice stopped him. "Sir," said a flight attendant, a woman with perfectly styled hair and a name tag that read Rachel Morrison. "Passengers in this section are boarding only after our pre-screen check." Marcus blinked. "I'm just joining my daughters. They're seated right there." Rachel smiled politely, but her tone carried an edge. "Yes, of course. I just need to confirm with the purser first. Please step aside." Marcus paused. There it was again, that same careful tone, that same undercurrent. He stepped back, keeping his voice even. "No problem." As he waited, he watched the girls from a distance. Maya was trying to figure out the seat controls. Arya was whispering to Isla, giggling. They looked so happy, so untouched. He wanted to keep it that way. So when Rachel finally waved him through, Marcus thanked her and walked past with quiet dignity. He sat down beside his daughters, smiling, settling in. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake it, that creeping sense that the air itself had changed. He didn't know what form it would take yet, but he knew the signs. He'd seen them in courtrooms, in offices, in 1,000 small humiliations dressed up as policy. And he knew something was coming. The plane doors closed. The hum of the engines rose. Marcus leaned back in his seat, held his daughter's hands, and whispered, "Almost there. Babies. Almost there." Outside, the clouds gathered, soft and white, deceptively calm. Inside, somewhere unseen, the storm was just beginning to form. If you've ever flown often enough, you know that the smallest glitch, a slow computer, a misread barcode can change everything. Most people just sigh, wait, and forget about it. But sometimes those small moments become the cracks where something deeper slips through. For Marcus Reed, it began with a soft beep that didn't sound quite right. He'd followed behind his daughters down the jet bridge, tickets in hand, heart finally lightening. The girls had gone ahead, their laughter bouncing down the narrow tunnel. The flight attendant at the door had waved them through cheerfully. "Aren't you three adorable?" Marcus smiled, grateful for a kindness where he could find it. But as he handed over his own boarding pass, the scanner gave a sharp red flash. The gate agent said, tapping the screen. "It's not reading." Marcus shifted his briefcase from one hand to the other. "No problem. Happens all the time. He'd said that phrase so often it had become a kind of armor, the calm voice of a man refusing to let frustration show. The agent frowned, tried again. Red light. She called over a supervisor. Marcus glanced down the tunnel. He could still hear his daughters giggling somewhere near the front of the plane. He checked his watch. 5 minutes until departure. Must be a system error, the supervisor said, smiling thinly. Could you step aside for a moment, sir? We just need to revalidate your ticket. Marcus's instincts twitched. It was always just a moment. Behind him, a few passengers grumbled about the delay. He stepped aside anyway, trying to stay composed. He wasn't about to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him lose patience. Inside the plane, he imagined Maya trying to help Isla with the seatbelt, Arya probably pressing every button in reach. Daddy said, "Sit still." He could almost hear Maya say, "Bossy, but sweet." He smiled at the thought. The supervisor clicked through the system, then frowned. Strange. It says you've already boarded. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's impressive, considering I'm standing right here. She laughed awkwardly. Technology. Huh? It was a harmless moment, the kind that should have ended in a shrug, but behind her forced cheer, Marcus sensed something else: hesitation. That quiet, familiar pause before someone wonders if they're about to make a mistake that's not their fault, but yours. He decided to make it easy. My daughters are already seated, he said gently. Can they stay on while you sort this out? The agent looked relieved. Of course. They're perfectly fine. It'll just take a few minutes. Marcus nodded, crouched down to speak softly to his girls before they disappeared completely into the cabin. Okay, angels, he said. Listen carefully. Stay in your seats. Okay, no wandering, no getting up. Daddy will be right behind you. Maya nodded solemnly. The little leader she was. Isla looked worried but obedient. Arya, of course, grinned and said, Don't take too long. Daddy Marcus laughed. Wouldn't dare. He gave them a final thumbs up, watched them settle in, and turned back toward the counter. It seemed like nothing a harmless choice, a father's trust in the system, but that was the moment the clock started ticking. The minutes dragged. 5, 10. The line behind him thinned as the last passengers boarded. He could see the flight attendants through the open door, checking compartments, smiling for the customers who mattered, the ones who didn't set off red lights on scanners. Finally, the supervisor returned. You're all set, Mr. Reed. Sorry about that. Just a computer glitch. Marcus gave a small, practiced smile. Happens to the best of us. He walked down the tunnel, but something inside him had shifted that uneasy feeling that starts as a whisper in the gut. When he stepped through the cabin door, the same flight attendant who'd smiled at his daughters earlier, Rachel Morrison, her name tag gleaming, looked startled to see him. Oh, I thought you were... Well, never mind, she said quickly, smoothing her uniform. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Thought I was what? She blinked. Nothing. Sir? Seat 1C. Correct. Yes. Ma'am. Her smile was polite, practiced, the kind of smile that doesn't forgive but pretends to forget. He nodded, said nothing more, and walked past. His daughters were exactly where he'd left them, sitting straight, hands folded, just like he'd asked. Maya waved proudly. See, we didn't move. Marcus chuckled and kissed the top of her head. Good job, sweetheart. But as he settled into his seat, he noticed something odd. A pair of passengers across the aisle, a middle-aged couple in business attire, were whispering to each other, glancing his way, then toward the girls. It wasn't hostile, exactly, just curious, the way people get when the story they see doesn't fit the picture in their heads. He'd learned long ago that curiosity could turn sharp without warning. He leaned back, breathed deep, and reminded himself grace, not anger. Up front, Rachel moved briskly through her routine adjusting headsets, collecting coats, greeting passengers by name. Every now and then, her eyes flicked toward Marcus and his girls, brief, assessing, unreadable. He didn't think much of it at first. He'd seen worse. He'd faced judges with colder eyes. But as the last few passengers found their seats, the plane door closed with a metallic click, that final, echoing sound that separates safety from surrender. Marcus looked out the window, trying to let go of the tension. Clouds drifted lazily outside, the tarmac gleaming under the sun. He thought of Naomi, then her voice. Calm and sure. You can't control what people think of you, Marcus, only how you carry yourself when they show it. He closed his eyes and whispered under his breath, I'm trying, baby. A few rows behind him, Rachel leaned in toward another flight attendant and murmured something. Marcus couldn't hear, but he caught his name, or thought he did. The other attendant looked surprised, then glanced his way. It was a fleeting exchange, a spark barely visible, but every storm starts small. Marcus adjusted his tie, smiled at his daughters, and reached for the in-flight magazine. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere in the system, maybe in a policy manual, maybe in a mind, an invisible line had already been crossed. A minor error, a polite delay, a father's small decision. Together, they had built the perfect setup for everything that was about to go wrong. And that's how it always begins, isn't it? Not with shouting, not with violence, but with silence and compliance, with good people trying not to make a scene. Marcus believed he was teaching his daughters patience. He didn't know he was teaching them survival. The engines roared to life, the plane began to taxi, and the hum beneath their feet grew steady and strong. He took his daughter's hands, smiling as the aircraft turned toward the runway. "See," he whispered, "told you we'd fly together." And as the plane lifted into the bright Carolina sky, he couldn't know that the real turbulence was already waiting not in the clouds, but in the hearts of those who'd already decided who they thought he was. The engine steadied into a low hum, the kind of sound that usually calms people, a sign that the hard part was over, that you were safely on your way. But for some reason, Marcus couldn't quite relax. Something about the air felt tight. Not dangerous, just uneasy, like a room that had forgotten how to breathe. And then, there she was. Rachel Morrison moved through the aisle with the grace of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Perfect posture, perfect hair, the crisp Navy uniform that spoke of professionalism and control. To any stranger, she looked like the definition of calm authority. But to those who knew her, and few did, Rachel was a woman balancing on the edge. At 39, she'd spent nearly 2 decades in the skies, watching other people's lives unfold from 30,000 feet. Engagement rings flashed, babies cried, businessmen complained. Rachel smiled through it all, her politeness polished to a shine that hid the cracks underneath. Those cracks, though, were getting harder to hide. Her marriage had ended the previous year, a quiet divorce filed between layovers. Her ex-husband, a pilot for another airline, had taken their teenage son to Denver. She told people it was amicable, but truthfully, it had gutted her. Her son barely spoke to her now. He blamed her for everything. So Rachel threw herself into work longer hours, double shifts, anything to stay busy, anything to stay above ground. But lately, she'd started to feel something she didn't want to name resentment. The world had stopped feeling fair to her. Every passenger seemed to want something. Everyone else's story felt heavier than her own. And when she saw people who looked too happy, too whole. It scraped against the raw edges of her own loneliness. When Rachel first noticed Marcus's daughter's boarding, she had forced a smile, but something in her tightened. 3 little girls, dressed neatly, laughing together. It should have been sweet. But to Rachel, it looked like noise, like a disruption to the quiet order she craved. And there was something else, something she'd never say out loud. A whisper of bias she didn't even question anymore. She'd seen stories on the news, heard jokes from coworkers that weren't really jokes. They had all bled together into assumptions she mistook for facts. She saw 3 black children in first class, unaccompanied, and before her mind could stop itself, it filled in a story that wasn't true. Her training had warned her about bias, about treating all passengers equally. But training doesn't undo instinct, especially when that instinct has been fed by years of quiet, cultural permission. So when she looked at those girls, bright-eyed, polite, clutching little backpacks with matching initials, she didn't see daughters of a civil rights attorney. She saw a situation. Rachel's co-worker, a younger attendant named Claire, noticed her expression. "They're sweet," Claire whispered, smiling. "Triplets." Can you imagine Rachel forced a nod? Adorable. But in her tone, something cold had already begun to form. As she prepared the cabin, Rachel found herself replaying the morning's stress. The supervisor had been late. The catering crew forgot the premium fruit trays. A passenger had snapped his fingers at her earlier for water. Her patience, the one thing she'd always prided herself on, was running on fumes. And when she saw Marcus finally board, that calm exterior slipped, just a little. He walked in quietly, briefcase in hand, shoulders straight, the kind of man who carried dignity like a second skin. Rachel didn't like men like that. They reminded her of her ex-husband, of every polished smile that had ever hidden a judgment. She didn't know Marcus's story, but something about his presence, confident yet restrained, irritated her. She told herself it was just the seating list, just logistics, but deep down, it wasn't. Something in her wanted to remind him who set the rules up here. After takeoff, Rachel began her rounds, checking belts and serving drinks. She passed by the Reed girls, who were chatting quietly, heads bent over a coloring book. "Excuse me," Maya said, polite as ever. "Could we have some orange juice? Please." Rachel paused. "Orange juice in first class, sweetie. We serve fresh squeezed, but maybe just water for now." "Okay." Her voice was light, almost cheerful, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Maya blinked, unsure what she'd said wrong. Isla looked down. Arya gave a nervous giggle, trying to break the tension. Rachel walked away, heels clicking. To her, it was nothing a quick correction. To the girls, it was the first hint that something wasn't quite right. Across the aisle, Marcus noticed the exchange. He didn't say anything yet, just watched, quietly. Years of law had taught him the power of patience. You let people show you who they are before you decide what to do about it. In the galley, Rachel checked her reflection in the small metal surface of the oven door. She looked tired. She hated that. She adjusted her hair, took a deep breath, and muttered, "Just another flight. Just get through it." But her eyes flicked back to where the Reed family sat. The unease returned, that subtle irritation she couldn't explain, like static under her skin. She told herself it was the noise, the questions, the mess. But what she really couldn't stand was the calm, the way Marcus handled everything with quiet grace, the way those children behaved as if they belonged there because they did. Something in her needed to disrupt that, to reassert order. That's the dangerous thing about people like Rachel. They don't wake up intending to hurt anyone. But when life has stripped them of control, they start looking for someone smaller to take it back from. And in her world, control always began with tone, with rules, with small reminders of how things work. So when she saw Marcus briefly close his eyes to rest, Rachel approached Claire and said, softly but firmly, "Those kids up front, do we have clearance for unaccompanied minors in first class? I thought policy restricted that." Claire frowned. "They're not unaccompanied. Their father's right there." Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. Right. She straightened her uniform, just checking. But the seed had already been planted in her mind and in the atmosphere of the cabin. Marcus opened his eyes just in time to see Rachel glance his way again. Something about the look made him sit up a little straighter. Not fearful, just alert. He turned his head, smiled faintly at his daughters, and thought, stay calm. Observe. He didn't know yet that Rachel Morrison, with all her invisible baggage, was about to become the match that lit the fuse. The storm wasn't here yet, but he could feel the wind shift. The flight had leveled off above the clouds, sunlight flooding through the oval windows in quiet streaks of gold. Passengers settled into their routines, coffee, newspapers, light conversation. For a few moments, it was almost peaceful. Marcus glanced over at his daughters. Maya was reading the in-flight magazine like it was a novel. Isla was sketching an airplane in her small notebook, and Arya was balancing a peanut on her nose, trying to make her sisters laugh. He smiled, that soft, proud kind of smile that only fathers have. It wasn't often life gave him stillness, and in that brief quiet he let himself believe maybe the tension from before had passed. But storms don't always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes they begin with a simple, practiced smile. Rachel Morrison returned to the aisle, the same cool confidence in her stride. She'd convinced herself that she'd regained control, that whatever uneasy feeling had started earlier was now gone. But when she glanced at the Reed girls again, it returned. The sight of them sitting so comfortably in first-class content, at ease, belonging, rubbed at something deep inside her, like grit under the skin. She paused beside them. "Hi, sweethearts," she said, voice sugar sweet. "Do you girls need to use the restroom before lunch service?" Maya looked up politely. "Yes, ma'am, please." Rachel smiled wider. "Perfect. The restroom in first class is, being serviced right now. But you can use the one in the back of the plane. Just ask one of the attendants there for help." "Okay." She said it lightly, as if doing them a favor. Maya hesitated. "Is it broken?" Rachel didn't miss a beat. "Yes, sweetheart. Plumbing issue." Marcus, half listening from his seat, looked up. "Everything all right?" Rachel turned toward him, her tone now measured and professional. "Yes, sir. Just a quick maintenance issue. We're making sure your daughters are comfortable." Marcus nodded slowly. "Thank you." And that was that. Or so it seemed. The three little girls unbuckled their belts and started down the aisle. It was a long walk, longer than it should have felt. The narrow corridor of the aircraft stretched out before them, lined with rows of faces. Some smiled kindly, others didn't look at all. Maya led the way, holding Isla's hand. Arya skipped behind, still cheerful. But as they passed from the plush carpet of first class into the narrower section beyond the curtain, something shifted. The air felt different, colder, crowded. Conversations paused. People stared. The girls didn't have the words for it, but they felt it. That quiet change in the room that happens when you walk into a space where people have already decided who you are. A flight attendant in economy, younger, friendly-looking, guided them to the back. "Hey, there you go. Sweethearts, right this way." She didn't question it, didn't know the story. When the girls returned, the walk back felt longer. Maya noticed how quiet people became as they passed. She didn't understand why, But somewhere deep inside, she felt that first faint sting of humiliation, one she wouldn't have been able to name yet, but would never quite forget. Meanwhile, Rachel was back up front, refilling cups and chatting with a passenger in a suit. She saw the girls return and gave a brief nod, like a queen dismissing her subjects. Marcus leaned over as they sat down. "Everything okay? Fine," Maya said quickly. The bathroom was really far. Marcus chuckled softly. "That's airplanes for you." But as he leaned back, something caught his eye. A man 2 rows ahead, a businessman with silver hair, stood up and walked straight into the first-class restroom, the very same one Rachel had just declared out of order. Marcus froze. He waited, half expecting Rachel to stop him, but she didn't. She smiled, even offered him a napkin as he passed. And in that small, cruel contrast, the lie became clear. His heart sank, but not from surprise. No, surprise would have meant he hadn't seen it coming. What he felt was something far older, quieter, and more familiar, the ache of recognition. He turned his head slowly, watching Rachel move through the aisle. Everything about her posture was calm, controlled. She was doing her job, on the surface. But beneath it, beneath every polite gesture and crisp sir and ma'am, there was a message. "You don't belong here." Marcus didn't move right away. He didn't want to make a scene. The girls were watching. He glanced at Maya, who sat with her hands clasped, her small face unusually still. She'd seen it too. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Marcus saw something he wished he hadn't the beginning of understanding. That moment when a child first realizes the world doesn't always play fair. He wanted to protect her from it. But how do you shield your children from something invisible? Something polite? He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Naomi's words echoed in his mind again. "You don't fight every battle with anger, Marcus. Some you win with dignity." He forced a calm smile. "Hey," he whispered to Maya. "Everything's fine. Okay, just enjoy the flight." She nodded, trying to smile back. But the damage was done. A few minutes later, Rachel walked by again, collecting glasses. She didn't look at them, but Maya couldn't stop watching her. And when another passenger, a white teenager, asked to use the same restroom, Rachel nodded without hesitation. That was the moment it stopped being a suspicion. It became truth. Maya's face flushed. She whispered to Isla. She lied. Isla frowned. "What?" She said the bathroom was broken. "It's not." Arya looked between them, confused. Maybe she forgot. Maya shook her head, her little voice trembling but firm. No, she didn't forget. Marcus heard it. Every word. He looked out the window, jaw tightening, heartbeat steady but strong. He didn't speak. Not yet. Years of courtroom restraint told him to wait, to observe, to collect, to remember, because in a world that pretends fairness, proof is the only weapon that counts. He reached over, squeezed Maya's hand gently. "You did nothing wrong," he whispered. "Never forget that." Maya looked at him, eyes bright but unsure. Why would she lie? Daddy Marcus held her gaze, searching for the right words. But there weren't any that wouldn't hurt. So he just said softly, "Some people forget how to see others as people, but that's on them, not on us." Outside, the clouds rolled like waves under the sun. Inside, the air had changed again, quieter now, heavier. Rachel continued down the aisle, unaware that her small decision had already cracked something she couldn't repair. She thought she'd asserted control. What she didn't realize was that she'd just revealed something much bigger than herself, the kind of truth that can't stay hidden once the right eyes have seen it. Marcus sat back, silent, calm. But inside, something in him began to shift, not toward anger, but toward resolve. Because dignity, when tested, doesn't crumble. It sharpens. And somewhere in that stillness, between the clouds in the cabin, a man who'd spent his life fighting injustice began preparing quietly, patiently for what was about to come next. There's a moment, right before things break, when the air feels heavier, like it's holding its breath. On Flight 447, that moment came during the drink service. Rachel Morrison moved down the aisle with her silver cart, the sound of clinking ice echoing softly under the hum of the engines. To anyone watching, she looked composed, efficient, the very picture of professionalism. But inside, she was unraveling. Her thoughts drifted to her son's unanswered text, to her ex-husband's new girlfriend, to the passenger 2 rows back who'd snapped his fingers at her like she was furniture, and under it all, that quiet bitterness toward the Reed family, toward the calm father who didn't flinch, and the 3 little girls who smiled like the world had never hurt them. Rachel was tired of smiling back. As she reached their row, she plastered on her service face. Juice or water? Sweetheart's Maya, the eldest, looked up. Orange juice, please. Rachel hesitated just a flicker before pouring. The glass filled too quickly. The turbulence was barely noticeable, but her hand trembled slightly. And in one swift motion, the glass slipped. Cold orange juice splashed down the front of her uniform, spreading across her skirt and dripping onto her black leather shoes. For a split second, silence. Then came the sound of liquid hitting the carpet. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Maya gasped, reaching instinctively for a napkin. Rachel froze. Something sharp flashed across her face, not pain, not surprise, but rage. It wasn't the juice. It wasn't the mess. It was everything that had been building behind her polite smile for months, years, and now it had found a target. Her voice, when it came, was low and trembling. "Did you just throw that at me?" Maya's eyes widened. "No, ma'am, I didn't." Rachel took a step forward, her shadow falling over the 3 little girls. "I asked you a question." Marcus looked up instantly, sensing the tone before the words. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said evenly. "It looks like it was an accident." Rachel turned on him, jaw tight. "Sir, please, I'll handle this." The cabin had gone quiet. Passengers glanced over their newspapers, the way people do when they sense trouble but don't yet understand it. Maya stammered again, voice shaking. "I didn't mean," Rachel snapped. "Don't you talk back to me." Aria flinched. Isla began to tear up. Rachel stood rigid, her uniform sticky with juice, her pride burning hotter than the stain spreading across her shirt. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that she was crossing a line, but she didn't stop. "You people think you can do whatever you want and just smile it away," she hissed under her breath. Then louder. "You think this is funny. You ruined government property. You disrespected a crew member." Marcus stood, calm but firm. "Rachel, sit down." "Sir," she barked, "you are not to interfere." Marcus froze, every instinct screaming to intervene, but one look at his daughter's frightened faces held him still. He couldn't make this worse. "Not yet." Rachel turned back to the girls. "You made this mess. You clean it up." Maya blinked, confused. "We can help, we'll wipe it." Rachel cut her off. "No. You'll do it properly." She pointed to her shoes, sticky, dripping with orange juice. "On your knees. Now." For a moment, the world stopped. You could hear the air vents, the faint rustle of someone's jacket. Even the engine seemed quieter. Maya didn't move. She couldn't. Isla grabbed her hand. Aria whimpered softly. "Daddy." Marcus stepped forward, voice steady, but cold. "That's enough." Rachel didn't back down. "You heard me," she said, loud enough for the whole cabin now. "On your knees, or I'll call security when we land." And just like that, it wasn't about juice anymore. It was about power. power. Passengers turned, murmuring. A man in business class pulled out his phone. Someone whispered, "Is she serious?" Rachel stood there, shaking but defiant. She'd lost control, and the only way she knew how to get it back was to push further. "Do it," she said again, voice trembling with fury. "Clean it. With your hands then, almost spitting the words, or your tongues, if you have to." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Marcus felt his pulse hammer in his chest. Every muscle in his body wanted to explode, to shout, to tear down the cruelty standing in front of him. But he didn't. He took one slow breath, eyes locked on Rachel. "Rachel Morrison," he said quietly, voice steady enough to make her falter. "You need to stop right now." She blinked. Your name's on your badge," he said. His tone was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of something far greater. "And there are 20 witnesses watching what you just said to my children." Someone in row 3 spoke up. "I'm recording this." Another voice. "That's enough, lady." Rachel's expression shifted anger to confusion, confusion to realization. The fog of rage lifted, and she suddenly saw herself the way everyone else did. A grown woman, towering over 3 terrified children, sticky glass in hand, the entire cabin staring, her face drained of color. That's not what I... But the damage was done. Marcus didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His restraint spoke louder than fury ever could. He reached for a napkin, knelt down himself, and began wiping the floor. "Girls," he said softly. "It's all right. Sit still." Rachel took a step back, her breathing uneven. She muttered something about turbulence, about misunderstanding, but the whispers around her had already turned into judgment. The businessman's camera stayed on her. Another passenger murmured, "Unbelievable." Marcus finished cleaning the spill, stood, and handed the napkin to Rachel with deliberate calm. "Here," he said. "You dropped this." It wasn't anger in his voice. It was something colder dignity sharpened to a blade. Rachel stared at him, speechless. He turned, knelt beside his daughters again. "You okay?" Maya nodded shakily. Isla sniffled. Arya clung to his arm. "Good," Marcus said softly. "Then, we're fine." The hum of the engines returned. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not just awkward, but loaded. Rachel stood frozen, every pair of eyes in the cabin on her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel in control. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his face unreadable. He didn't need to shout. The truth was already louder than any voice, and somewhere, deep inside, Rachel Morrison began to understand, though she'd never admit it, that she hadn't just spilled juice. She'd spilled her mask. For a few long seconds, the cabin felt like a courtroom, silent, tense, everyone waiting to see who would speak next. Rachel stood frozen in the aisle, the orange stain drying on her uniform. The sound of her own breathing filled her ears. She wanted to move, to fix it somehow, but every movement felt wrong. Every pair of eyes on her was a verdict. And then a voice came deep, steady, and impossible to ignore. "Excuse me, miss." It came from seat 3A, a few rows behind Marcus and the girls. The man who spoke rose slowly, calm, but with the quiet authority of someone used to being listened to. His salt and pepper hair caught the cabin light, and the simple watch on his wrist gleamed like a statement of understatement. Expensive, but not showy. Daniel Thompson, though no one recognized him yet, was the kind of man who carried influence like a shadow, never loud, but always present. CEO of West Air International, one of the airline's major shareholders and a member of its board of directors. He didn't like flying on his own company's planes, said it made him see too much. But today, He was exactly where he needed to be. "Ma'am," he said gently, but his tone left no room for dismissal. "I think we need to talk about what just happened." Rachel turned, startled. "Sir, this is a private matter with 3 children." His eyebrow lifted. "On a public flight, I don't think so." A few heads nodded. Phones were still recording. The hum of whispers rose, carrying judgment like a tide. Rachel's professionalism cracked. I was simply enforcing order. Daniel raised a hand. "Let's not rewrite the truth while half the cabin's got it on camera." Her face drained of color. "Camera." He nodded calmly. "Yes, ma'am, I've got footage, and I'm sure others do too." He gestured around. Several passengers lifted their phones, confirming it. Rachel's mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since the incident began, she looked small, not in stature, but in certainty. Daniel's voice softened, but the steel remained. "You asked 3 little girls to kneel in public. You implied something so indecent, I won't repeat it. And now you want to call it procedure." He let the question hang in the air. No one spoke. Not even the engines seemed to hum as loud. Rachel's hands trembled. "Sir, you don't understand. I understand perfectly," he said, cutting her off not with anger, but with precision. "I've worked in this industry for 30 years. I've seen what happens when power gets too comfortable. People forget that customer service doesn't mean control." Marcus sat silently, watching. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, only quiet gratitude and measured restraint. He wasn't here to humiliate Rachel. He was watching justice begin to breathe on its own. Daniel turned toward Marcus, offering a respectful nod. "Sir, I assume these are your daughters." Marcus rose slightly. "Yes, Maya, Isla, and Aria Reed." Daniel's expression softened. "You've raised them well. Their composure just taught half this cabin more about grace than most training programs ever could." A murmur of agreement rippled through the passengers. Rachel tried to regain footing. "Sir, if you're with the airline, perhaps you should remain impartial." Daniel almost smiled. "Oh, I am impartial." "Ms. Morrison, impartial to truth." He looked toward the nearest attendant, Claire, who had stood quietly near the galley, torn between loyalty and conscience. "Claire," he said, voice calm. "What did you see?" Claire hesitated only a moment before straightening. "Everything, sir." The children did nothing wrong. The spill wasn't their fault. Rachel's face fell. "Claire, don't." But Claire didn't back down. They were polite, respectful. "You told them to go to the back. You told them to kneel. And you raised your voice." A gasp from somewhere near row 6. Someone muttered, "My God." Daniel nodded slowly. "Thank you, Claire." Then, turning back to Rachel, he said, "Now, before this goes any further, I want you to understand something. This isn't just about 3 children. It's about a culture, one that allows small humiliations to grow into big injustices. And as long as I have a say in this company, that culture ends today." Rachel stood rigid, blinking fast, her face pale. "Sir, I didn't mean I believe you didn't mean to," he interrupted gently. "But that doesn't make it right." He motioned toward the passengers. "There are witnesses, video evidence, and, most importantly, 3 young lives who will carry this memory. You'll answer for it, but not here. Not like this." He looked at Marcus again. "Sir, I'd like to make sure your family is treated with respect for the remainder of this flight." Marcus nodded. "I appreciate that." Rachel started to speak again, but Daniel lifted a hand. Enough. Take a seat in the back until we land. I'll handle it with the captain personally. The words hit harder than a shout. Rachel hesitated, glancing around for backup that wasn't there. Even the other attendants looked away. Finally, with trembling fingers, she set the service tray down and walked down the aisle, a slow, silent march past the passengers who'd seen everything. No one said a word, but silence can sting more than insults. As she disappeared into the rear cabin, the plane seemed to exhale. Daniel turned back toward Marcus. "You have my word," he said quietly. "This won't disappear into paperwork." Marcus studied him for a moment, the lawyer in him weighing sincerity. Then he extended a hand. "Thank you." "Mr. Thompson," the man replied. Daniel Thompson. The name clicked somewhere in Marcus's mind. The Daniel Thompson. Daniel smiled faintly. "I suppose so. But right now, I'm just another passenger who couldn't stay seated." The two men shook hands, not as lawyer and CEO, not as symbols of race or status, but as fathers who knew what it meant to protect dignity. From a few rows behind, a woman spoke up. "Sir, if you need witnesses, I'll give a statement." "I saw everything." Another voice. "Me too." Soon, nearly half the cabin had raised their hands, and in that quiet, collective moment, something extraordinary happened. The power shifted. The story that began as humiliation was now being written by those who refused to look away. Marcus sat down, his daughters leaning into him. He squeezed their hands gently. "It's over now," he whispered. "You did nothing wrong." Maya nodded, eyes still wide but calmer. Isla leaned against him. Arya, brave in her innocence, whispered, "She's in trouble." "Huh?" Marcus smiled softly. "Maybe, but we don't need to celebrate that. We just need to remember what happened." Daniel overheard, his expression softening. Wise words. "Mr. Reed." Marcus looked up, and their eyes met two men from different worlds, bound for the same understanding that power only means something when it protects, not when it humiliates. Outside, the clouds parted slightly, sunlight pouring through like a quiet benediction. Inside, the flight moved forward not peacefully yet, but with a sense that something right had finally begun. When Daniel Thompson sat back down, the cabin slowly began to breathe again. The hum of the engines returned, passengers whispered in relief, and a few even clapped quietly, not for victory, but for decency. Marcus hadn't moved much. He was still sitting with his daughters, one arm around them, eyes steady on the aisle where Rachel had just disappeared. His heart was calm now, not because the anger was gone, but because he had mastered it. Naomi used to tell him, sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. He'd finally learned what she meant. But deep down, Marcus knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because dignity wasn't restored by silence alone, it needed to be witnessed. It needed to be named. A soft knock came at the cockpit door. Then the captain's voice, composed but edged with authority. "Mr. Reed, could you come forward?" "Please." Marcus glanced at Daniel, who gave him a small nod. "They're ready to talk." He rose slowly, brushing the wrinkles from his shirt, then turned to his girls. "Stay with Mr. Thompson. Okay, you're safe." Maya clung to his sleeve. "Daddy, are you mad?" Marcus knelt, met her eyes. "I'm proud," he said simply. "That's what I am." He gave them each a kiss on the forehead, then walked down the aisle, not like a man going to fight, but like a man going to finish something he'd already won in principle. The cabin fell silent again. People turned their heads, phones ready, not to feed gossip this time, but to bear witness. Near the galley, Rachel Morrison stood stiffly, eyes red, uniform stained, her posture defensive. The Captain Rodriguez, a composed woman in her 40s with a voice that could cut through any storm, stood between them. "Mr. Reed," she began. "Mr. Thompson has briefed me. We're verifying statements. I'd like to hear directly from you before we proceed further." Marcus nodded, calm and deliberate. "Of course." Rachel shifted uneasily, opening her mouth. "Captain, I think Ms. Morrison," Rodriguez said sharply. "You'll have a chance to speak after Mr. Reed." That small moment, the reversal of who held the floor, changed everything. Marcus took a deep breath. His tone was even, almost gentle, but every word carried weight. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," he began. "I'm here to make sure the truth is respected, because 3 little girls just learned something about the world they shouldn't have had to learn at 6 years old." He paused. The captain nodded for him to continue. "They were polite. They followed instructions. And they were lied to, singled out, and publicly degraded. That's not a misunderstanding. That's discrimination." Rachel crossed her arms. "I said I was sorry." Marcus turned his gaze on her. Not angry, just piercing. "No, ma'am." "You said you didn't mean it. That's different." The words landed like a gavel. "You may not have meant to, but intent doesn't erase impact," he continued. "I've spent 20 years in civil rights law. I've heard that sentence in 100 courtrooms. It never holds up." Rachel's face flushed. "You're twisting this." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You twisted it the moment you looked at my children and saw a problem instead of passengers." Even the captain inhaled sharply at that. Daniel stood quietly near the cockpit entrance, watching not to intervene, but to witness. There was something poetic about it, a father, a lawyer, a black man standing in the narrow aisle of an airplane, that floating microcosm of society, turning injustice into a lesson in restraint. The cabin crew had gathered too, their faces solemn. Claire, the younger attendant, held back tears. Captain Rodriguez spoke carefully. "Mr. Reed, your concern will be fully documented. I assure you of that." Marcus nodded, but his gaze stayed on Rachel. "Documentation isn't enough. I want a record of every passenger who witnessed this. No one leaves until statements are made." Rodriguez straightened. "That's within your rights. We'll cooperate." Rachel scoffed softly. "You can't detain an entire plane for your drama." Marcus didn't raise his voice, but the calm in it was colder than any shout. "This isn't drama, Ms. Morrison," he said. "This is civil rights. And as of this moment, I'm representing 3 victims, all of whom happen to be my daughters." Rachel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He continued, "Every person on this plane is a witness. Every phone that recorded this is evidence. And every apology that comes too late will be part of the report." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. The captain looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Thompson, you confirm you have footage?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, Captain, multiple angles. I'll submit them directly to your internal review and to Mr. Reed's office." Rachel turned toward him, stunned. You're with the airline." Daniel's tone was calm, measured. "I am, and I've just witnessed one of the most disgraceful breaches of protocol I've seen in 20 years. Rachel swallowed hard. The room seemed to tilt. Marcus looked around at the faces strangers who, for once, weren't looking away. "This isn't just about one person losing their temper," he said. "It's about what happens when silence gives permission." He glanced toward his daughters, still sitting with Daniel, their little hands folded neatly in their laps. They didn't cry out. They didn't yell back. They trusted that someone, anyone, would stand up for them. That's faith. And I won't let that faith go unanswered. The captain spoke quietly. but firmly. Understood. Rachel Morrison, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. You'll be debriefed upon landing. Rachel's voice cracked. Captain, please take a seat in the back. Rodriguez said, that's an order. It was more than a command. It was justice beginning to take form. Rachel hesitated, then walked past Marcus, head down, silent, the walk of shame long and heavy. Marcus didn't watch her go. He simply exhaled, closed his eyes, and whispered something to himself, a line Naomi used to say, the measure of a person isn't how loud they demand respect, but how quietly they give it. When he opened his eyes again, Captain Rodriguez extended her hand. Mr. Reed, she said softly, thank you for your composure. You handled this better than most would have. Marcus shook her hand. It's not composure, he said. It's discipline, the kind we've had to learn just to survive. The captain nodded slowly. She understood more than she said. Then Daniel stepped forward. Marcus, he said quietly, we'll handle this, but I want you to know when this story reaches the boardroom, it won't get buried. Marcus met his eyes. I'm counting on that. They shook hands again, this time not in tension, but in alliance. As he returned to his seat, the passengers began to clap, not loud, not theatrical, but the kind of applause that carries relief, respect, and something deeper. Maya looked up at him. Daddy, did we do something bad? Marcus smiled, a little weary, a little proud. No, sweetheart, you just saw what happens when good people don't stay quiet. The girls leaned into him, and he held them close, staring out at the clouds beyond the window. The sky stretched endlessly, calm and bright, and for the first time in hours, it felt like breathing again. For a few moments, no one moved. The tension that had filled the cabin had shifted, no longer sharp and angry, but heavy and solemn. Everyone knew something irreversible had just happened. Marcus sat quietly with his daughters. The storm had passed, but the air still felt charged, like the quiet after thunder. Little Arya had drifted off in his lap, her tiny hand still clutching his sleeve. Maya and Isla leaned together, whispering softly, their voices no longer afraid, just tired. Marcus looked at them and thought, they'll remember this day, but what they remember depends on what happens next. He turned his gaze toward the front of the plane, toward authority. And authority, as it turned out, was already on its way. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Elena Rodriguez stepped out. She wasn't tall, but her presence filled the narrow aisle effortlessly. Everything about her, from the calm precision in her stride to the quiet steadiness of her eyes, said one thing: control without cruelty. Rodriguez had been flying for 20 years, through thunderstorms, engine failures, even one emergency landing that made national news. But nothing tested her command quite like moments like this, when she had to steer not just a machine, but human decency. She spoke softly, yet her voice carried through the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your patience. We've been made aware of a situation that occurred between a member of our crew and several passengers. I'm here to address it directly. A murmur rolled through the rows. People put away their phones, sensing something important was about to unfold. Rachel Morrison sat stiffly in the jump seat near the galley, arms crossed, eyes red but defiant. She looked up as the captain approached, but Rodriguez's expression gave nothing away. Ms. Morrison, the captain said quietly. Stand up, please. Rachel hesitated. Captain, Rodriguez repeated. Now. The authority in that single word left no room for debate. Rachel rose slowly, the sound of her seatbelt clicking open echoing louder than it should have. Rodriguez turned slightly toward Marcus. Mr. Reed, Mr. Thompson. I've reviewed your accounts and spoken to both passengers and crew. I've also viewed portions of recorded footage. She glanced around the cabin, meeting the eyes of those who had filmed. Thank you for your cooperation. What happened on this flight was unacceptable and will not be tolerated on any aircraft under my command. A few passengers nodded, quiet but approving. Rachel's lips parted. Captain, I was under stress. You know what it's like. Passengers Rodriguez cut her off, gently but firmly. I know exactly what it's like. Ms. Morrison. I've had passengers scream in my face. I've had engines fail mid-air, and I've never once forgotten who I was representing. Her tone wasn't angry. It was controlled, the kind of control Rachel had mistaken for weakness her whole career. Rodriguez stepped closer. You used your uniform as a weapon. You humiliated 3 children. You lied to their father. And when you were given the chance to correct it, you doubled down. Rachel swallowed hard. I didn't mean. The captain raised a hand. Intent does not erase harm. The words hung in the air like law. You are officially relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Rodriguez continued. You'll disembark under escort in Los Angeles, where our corporate ethics team and legal counsel will meet you for a full review. Rachel's face crumpled, but the captain's gaze didn't waver. For now, she added, you'll take a seat in the last row. You are a passenger, not crew. You will not interact with anyone, including the Reeds. That was when the murmurs began, not cruel laughter, not applause, just the sound of recognition. The kind of murmurs people make when they know they've just witnessed a lesson. As Rachel gathered her things, her hands shook. The long aisle ahead of her seemed endless. She avoided every eye, but it was impossible not to feel their weight, the eyes of witnesses, of passengers who'd seen what power looks like when it forgets compassion. It was a walk of shame. Yes, but not a public humiliation. It was accountability made visible. She walked past Marcus without looking up. He didn't smirk or gloat. He simply inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, not of victory, but of closure. Rachel paused for half a heartbeat, maybe to speak, maybe to plead, but no words came. She kept walking, disappearing toward the back of the cabin. When she sat down, alone in the last row, the distance between her and the family she'd tried to demean felt immeasurable, a physical representation of the moral gap she'd created herself. Captain Rodriguez turned back toward Marcus and Daniel. Gentlemen, I want to personally apologize on behalf of this airline. Daniel stood. Elena, I'll be filing an official internal report. Legal will want your statement. Rodriguez nodded. They'll have it before we land. Marcus extended his hand. Thank you. Captain. Rodriguez shook it firmly. No, Mr. Reed. Thank you. You handled yourself with restraint I wish more people had. It's not easy. Staying calm when the world gives you every reason not to. Marcus gave a faint smile. It's a survival skill. Rodriguez exhaled slowly. Well, it's also leadership. Back in first class, the tension began to dissolve. Passengers started whispering again, not about gossip this time, but about courage. Some offered quiet smiles to Marcus's daughters. One woman leaned over the aisle and said softly, Your dad's a good man. Maya smiled back, small but proud. A few minutes later, Captain Rodriguez returned to the cockpit. Her co-pilot glanced at her. Everything good. She nodded, adjusting her headset. It will be. And when she pushed the throttle forward, the engines roared, steady and strong like the sound of order being restored. Marcus leaned back, finally allowing himself to breathe. He looked down at his daughters, who were nestled together under a blanket. Their innocence had been bruised, but not broken. He turned to Daniel. "You didn't have to step in back there," Marcus said quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. "No, but sometimes the right person standing up at the right moment can change more than policy. It can change perception." Marcus nodded. "That's how justice starts, one person deciding silence isn't an option." Daniel chuckled. "And here I thought I was the only lawyer in the cabin." They both laughed softly. Two men on opposite sides of privilege, finding common ground somewhere above the clouds. Outside, the sky was beginning to fade into dusk, a soft golden light cutting through the windows, bathing everything in quiet redemption. Inside, the balance of power had shifted. The system, flawed as it was, had corrected itself, if only for a moment. And sometimes, that's enough to keep faith alive. When Captain Rodriguez returned to the cockpit and the engines steadied into their usual rhythm, a quiet sense of relief settled over the cabin. Not the loud kind, no applause, no cheers, just a collective exhale. The kind that comes after people have seen something ugly and are grateful it's over. Marcus Reed sat back in his seat, eyes closed for the first time in hours. The girls were safe beside him, curled under a single blanket that smelled faintly of airplane cotton and vanilla cookies. Arya had drifted to sleep again, her small hand still resting on his. Isla leaned against his shoulder, and Maya sat quietly by the window, watching clouds roll past like slow-moving waves. Marcus could still hear Naomi's voice in his mind. "When someone wrongs you, don't let it take your peace, make it fuel your purpose." He'd lived by that his whole life. But tonight, the words felt heavier because this time, the ones who'd been hurt were his daughters. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Reed." He looked up to see Claire, the younger flight attendant, standing there with a small smile. In her hands was a tray, 3 little cups of vanilla ice cream, each topped with a tiny chocolate cookie. "I thought they could use a treat," she said quietly. "I made sure it's the kind without nuts, the good kind." Marcus felt something tighten in his throat. "Thank you," he said softly. Claire knelt beside the girls and whispered, "You 3 are the bravest passengers I've ever met." Maya gave her a small, shy smile. "We didn't cry that much." Claire grinned. That's more than most adults could say today. Her kindness seemed to break a spell. Passengers nearby began to turn, offering gentle smiles, small waves, even words of encouragement. A woman across the aisle leaned over, handing Marcus a napkin. "For the little one's hands," she said. Another passenger, a man in his 60s with a deep southern drawl, added, "Sir, you handled yourself with real grace. I'll be telling my grandkids about this one." Marcus nodded, humbled. "Thank you. It's been a long day." The man chuckled. "Yeah, but you showed folks how it's done." Moments like that, soft, unplanned, began to stitch the cabin back together. Humanity, after all, is rarely loud. It's in the quiet gestures, the shared glance, the offered cookie, the whispered, "Are you all right?" between strangers. Daniel Thompson had been sitting quietly a few rows back, watching. He'd seen countless business crises in his life, lawsuits, firings, corporate scandals, but this was something else. This was human. He stood, walked up to Marcus's row, and gestured toward the empty seat beside him. "May I?" Marcus nodded. Daniel sat down, the air between them thick with unspoken understanding. For a moment, neither spoke. They just watched the clouds, 2 men from different worlds, bound by a shared disgust for what they'd seen and a shared determination to fix it. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. You know, I've spent half my career writing policies to prevent this sort of thing, and still it happens." Marcus gave a soft, knowing smile. "Policies don't change people. People change people." Daniel nodded slowly. "You're right, and the only way they change is when someone forces them to look in the mirror." Marcus tilted his head. "You planning on holding up the mirror?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I was hoping we'd hold it together." They ordered 2 coffees, bitter, lukewarm, and perfect for the moment. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Well," Daniel said, leaning back. "First thing, the airline's going to issue an apology. Then we'll suspend her permanently. Of course, PR will do what PR does, polish the story. Talk about our values." Marcus waited, saying nothing. Daniel sighed. "But I know that's not enough, and I suspect you do too." Marcus nodded. "I've fought too many cases like this to believe the headline ever tells the whole story." He glanced toward his daughters. "This isn't about one woman losing her temper. It's about the systems that make her think she can and get away with it." Daniel studied him for a moment. "You sound like a man who's about to file a lawsuit." Marcus smiled, but there was no malice in it. Not for revenge, for change. Daniel chuckled softly. "You remind me of my wife. She says I only listen when someone sues me." They both laughed, the first real laugh either of them had shared since takeoff. Then Daniel's tone grew more serious. "If you decide to go forward, I'll back you, not as a formality, as an ally. We'll review our training, our hiring, our internal bias programs, all of it. It's time this company stopped reacting to outrage and started preventing it." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we're on the same page." Daniel extended his hand. "To partnership." Marcus shook it. "To accountability." As the 2 men spoke quietly, other passengers began to drift over, some offering sympathy, others just wanting to share their stories. One older woman from row 8 said she'd grown up in Birmingham in the 60s. "Didn't think I'd see this kind of thing again," she whispered, eyes wet. Marcus smiled kindly. "Thank you for standing with us." She shook her head. "No, son. Thank you for standing without shouting." Later, Claire returned with a small tablet. "The girls wanted to watch a movie," she said, smiling. "I downloaded one for them, Finding Nemo." Maya grinned. "That's our mom's favorite movie." Marcus froze for just a second, surprised, then smiled softly. Yes, it was." The girls giggled as the screen lit up, their laughter breaking the last of the tension. Passengers nearby smiled, grateful for the sound. Daniel leaned back and said quietly, "You know, I've been in meetings where men twice your age lost their temper over a delayed flight. You kept your soul intact through something much worse." Marcus looked at him, thoughtful. "Anger's easy. It's control that takes practice." Daniel nodded. "I'll remember that." The rest of the flight unfolded in a strange, peaceful quiet. The hum of the engines felt softer now, almost like a lullaby. Someone offered cookies to the girls. Another passenger pulled out a guitar and played a soft tune that floated through the cabin like a prayer. By the time the captain announced their descent into Los Angeles, it no longer felt like a plane full of strangers. It felt like a small community that had been through something together and come out the other side a little more human. Marcus glanced at Daniel. "You ever think maybe things have to break before they can get fixed?" Daniel smiled. "Only every day." As the plane tilted downward, sunlight streamed through the windows, golden, forgiving. Marcus looked at his daughters and saw not fear, but quiet strength. They'd lost a bit of innocence, yes, but they'd gained something deeper, the knowledge that even in the face of cruelty, grace is power. He took a deep breath, looked out at the fading clouds, and whispered under his breath, "Naomi, you'd be proud of them." By the time the cabin lights dimmed and the engine steadied for the second time that night, the air inside Flight 447 felt different, lighter somehow. The earlier tension had dissolved into something quieter, something almost sacred. The hum of whispered conversation replaced the chaos. Passengers who'd once sat rigid in their seats now leaned toward each other, talking in low, empathetic tones. A child somewhere in the back laughed softly, and for the first time in hours, no one flinched at the sound. Marcus Reed sat with his daughters nestled against him. The glow from the overhead lights traced the soft outlines of their faces, the innocence that had been bruised but not broken. Isla was half asleep, her head on his shoulder. Aria hummed quietly, a tune from a lullaby Naomi used to sing. Maya held her father's hand and asked in a whisper, "Daddy, are we going home now?" Marcus smiled faintly. "We are, sweetheart. We really are." It wasn't the destination he meant. It was the return to something deeper: safety, dignity, and a world where right still mattered. A few rows up, Captain Elena Rodriguez sat alone for a moment in the cockpit, headset resting on the console, eyes closed. She'd flown through thunderstorms, mechanical failures, and mid-air emergencies. But what she had just witnessed tonight was a different kind of turbulence, one no checklist could prepare her for. When she finally opened her eyes, she glanced at the small silver photo clipped near the instrument panel, her daughter, aged 10, grinning with missing front teeth. Rodriguez took a deep breath. She knew exactly what she needed to say. She adjusted the intercom, flicked the switch, and her calm, steady voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The quiet chatter stopped instantly. "I want to take a moment to address what's happened tonight. As captain, it's my duty to ensure your safety. But safety isn't just about altitude or engines, it's about dignity. And tonight, that dignity was violated on my watch." Her voice never cracked, but the emotion in it carried far more power than volume ever could. "On behalf of this airline, I offer my deepest apology to the Reed family and to every passenger who had to witness injustice unfold in a space meant for trust and respect. I also want to thank those who spoke up. Your courage matters. It reminds us that silence in the face of wrong is not neutrality, it's participation." The cabin stayed silent. No one shifted. No one looked away. Rodriguez continued, "If any of you ever experience behavior that undermines the dignity of another person, whether here, in the air, or on the ground, I encourage you to report it. Because the truth is, equality isn't just a policy. It's a responsibility. Ours. All of ours." There was a pause, a moment heavy with reflection. "Now," she said softly, "let's take this flight home. Together." Then she clicked off the mic. In row 4, Daniel Thompson exhaled slowly. "Well," he murmured, half to himself, "there's the leadership I keep preaching about in board meetings." Marcus smiled faintly. If only more people practiced it outside of meetings. Daniel chuckled. "Touché." He looked toward the front. "She's good. She's decent." Marcus replied. "That's rarer." Their eyes met in understanding. A few passengers began to clap, not loud, not dramatic, just soft applause that grew naturally, one seat at a time, like a wave of quiet affirmation. It wasn't for entertainment. It was for truth. Claire, standing near the galley, wiped her eyes discreetly and began helping an elderly passenger adjust her seatbelt. The older woman whispered, "It's been a long time since I heard an apology that sounded real." Claire smiled. "It's about time we all started meaning it." Moments later, the plane began to taxi down the runway again. The soft rumble underfoot was familiar, almost comforting. Marcus could feel the vibration travel up through his shoes, a low reminder of motion forward, steady, unstoppable. Maya peered out the window. "Daddy, we're moving again." "Yes, we are." "Does that mean the bad part's over?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, then said softly, "The bad part's over when we make sure it never happens again." She nodded solemnly, as if she understood more than he'd hoped. The engines roared, louder now, and the plane began to lift. Outside, the city lights of Houston faded into a sea of black and gold below, and for a moment, the world looked calm. Inside the cabin, the light dimmed to a soft amber glow. Daniel reached into his briefcase, pulled out a small notepad, and scribbled something. Then he handed it to Marcus. "What's this?" Marcus asked. "A draft," Daniel said simply. "An initiative, a program we'll launch company-wide. Training, accountability, real oversight. No more checkbox diversity sessions. Real reform." Marcus read the first line aloud. "The Justice Flight Initiative for Dignity in the Skies." He looked up, surprised. "You're serious?" Daniel nodded. "We're both fathers. We both fly. Let's make sure our kids never see something like this again." Marcus folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Then, let's make it count." As the plane climbed, Marcus glanced out at the horizon. The clouds below glowed silver against the moonlight. He thought of Naomi, her laugh, her patience, her belief that grace was stronger than fury. He whispered quietly, "We're still flying, love." For the first time since boarding, his chest felt light. About an hour into the flight, Claire returned with refills of coffee, one for Marcus, one for Daniel. "Compliments of the captain," she said, smiling. Marcus chuckled softly. "Tell her she doesn't need to do that." Claire shook her head. "She knows. She wanted to anyway." Marcus took the cup and sipped slowly. It was still airplane coffee thin, bitter, but somehow it tasted different now. Not better, just more human. The rest of the flight passed in peaceful quiet. Some passengers slept. Others stared out their windows, lost in thought. There was no gossip now, no whispering, no discomfort, only the steady hum of the engines, carrying a cabin full of strangers who, for a brief time, had shared something real. As they began their descent into Los Angeles, Rodriguez's voice came through again, calm and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for your patience and for reminding us what compassion looks like when it counts." Marcus looked at his daughters, 3 small faces glowing in the soft light. They had endured something unjust, and yet they had come out stronger, surrounded by the quiet power of decency. He leaned back and whispered, "That's how you change the world, not with anger, but with grace." The wheels touched down softly, and the plane rolled to a gentle stop. Applause rippled again, but this time, it wasn't for landing. It was for healing, somewhere near the back. Rachel Morrison sat in silence, eyes downcast. Perhaps, Marcus thought, she too was learning something tonight, not about punishment, but about consequence. As passengers began to gather their things, Captain Rodriguez stepped out of the cockpit one last time, her uniform crisp, her face calm. She walked down the aisle slowly. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused. "Mr. Reed," she said, "thank you for reminding us who we're supposed to be." Marcus smiled gently. "Thank you for reminding us what leadership looks like." They shook hands, not as passenger and captain, but as equals in purpose. By the time Flight 447 touched down in Los Angeles, the world already knew what had happened. Marcus didn't know it yet. He was too busy helping Maya untangle her seatbelt, too busy brushing cookie crumbs from Isla's hair, too busy carrying a half-asleep Arya in his arms. To him, it was still a private wound, something that had happened in a closed cabin, between a handful of people who had witnessed cruelty and chosen decency instead. But outside those airplane doors, something bigger was already unfolding. It started small, as these things usually do. A passenger named Laura Kim, a travel blogger in row 12, uploaded a short clip to her followers. The video was shaky, taken in secret, but it caught everything that mattered: Rachel Morrison's sharp voice, the trembling little hands of the three girls, and Marcus's calm, steady tone when he said, "You twisted it the moment you looked at my children and saw a problem instead of passengers." Laura didn't add commentary. She didn't need to. She just wrote 4 words under the post. "This is Flight 447. Within an hour, her post had 1 million views. By hour 2, it had a hashtag Flight 447 Justice. And by the time Marcus and his daughters were walking down the jet bridge, hand in hand, the world was already arguing, grieving, and awakening all at once. On the plane, the Wi-Fi had been spotty, but as Daniel Thompson's phone reconnected, it began buzzing nonstop, dozens of notifications, pings, and missed calls. His assistant, his PR team, even his teenage son had texted the same thing: "Dad, you're trending." He turned to Marcus, who was adjusting Arya's blanket. "Marcus," Daniel said slowly, "I think people are watching." Marcus frowned, watching what Daniel handed him his phone. The video was there, millions of views, thousands of comments, some angry, some heartbroken, all human. One comment read, "Those babies could have been mine." Another, "That man's calm is the kind of strength we need." And another, from an airline employee, "We see you, Mr. Reed. Some of us are fighting inside too." Marcus read them silently, then handed the phone back. "I didn't plan for this." Daniel nodded. "No one ever does. But sometimes the truth decides to speak whether we're ready or not." As the passengers began to disembark, reporters were already gathering at the gate. Word had spread faster than any corporate statement could ever catch. By the time Captain Rodriguez opened the door and led the crew out, flashes from cameras were bouncing off the cabin walls. Captain Rodriguez: "Can you comment on the incident? Was racial discrimination involved? Who is the man in the video?" Rodriguez shielded her eyes from the lights, keeping her composure. "My only comment," she said evenly, "is that the truth is already in the video." Marcus didn't stop for interviews. He just walked, quietly, his daughters holding tight to his hands. But every few steps, someone stopped and whispered a thank you. A janitor, a flight attendant from another airline, a woman in uniform who said, "You made my daughter proud today." Each one of those quiet acknowledgments hit harder than applause. By the next morning, the story had taken over national news. Headlines across screens read, "Civil Rights. Attorney defends triplets against racist flight attendant. Airline under fire." Flight 447 Justice. The story that's making America talk again. From outrage to reform. The man who chose dignity over fury. On talk shows, anchors debated the meaning of it all, what it said about race, class, and the systems that quietly enable cruelty. But while pundits argued, something far more important was happening. Everyday people were reflecting. Teachers discussed it in classrooms, parents talked about it over dinner, churches mentioned it in sermons, and somewhere in Atlanta, an old neighbor of Marcus's, a retired teacher who'd once watched him walk to school with hand-me-down shoes, and quiet determination watched the footage on her TV and whispered, "He's still fighting," just like his mama taught him. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, Daniel Thompson sat in a boardroom filled with executives who suddenly looked very small. He set his phone down on the table, showing the headline still climbing the charts. "Mayber Flight 447, Justice, 10 million views and counting. We don't need damage control, he said flatly. We need a conscience. One vice president cleared his throat. Sir, we can release a public statement. Daniel interrupted. No statements until we've spoken to Marcus Reed. Personally, another executive muttered. You mean the man suing us? Daniel looked up. I mean the man teaching us. Back in Los Angeles, Marcus had finally tucked the girls into bed at a hotel provided by the airline. They'd been given matching pajamas, warm food, and more apologies than anyone could count. But what stayed with Marcus wasn't the gestures, it was the feeling of eyes on them, the weight of being seen. He stepped out onto the balcony, the city lights sprawling below like a reflection of the sky. He thought of Naomi again, how she used to tell him that every act of cruelty revealed more about the abuser than the abused. He whispered into the night, Looks like the world finally saw what you were talking about. A few hours later, his phone buzzed. A message from Daniel Tern on the news. Marcus did. The anchor's voice was calm, almost reverent. This evening, the CEO of SkyReach Airlines announced a company-wide initiative in response to the viral Flight 447 incident. The program, titled the Justice Flight Initiative, will establish new anti-discrimination measures, training, and public accountability reports across all departments. The screen cut to footage of Daniel at a podium, saying clearly, the man in that video reminded us what leadership looks like, calm in the face of cruelty. His daughters reminded us what innocence looks like when it's tested. We can't undo what happened, but we can make sure it never happens again. Marcus turned off the TV and exhaled. The city was quiet now, but something inside him felt alive again. Not pride, not relief, something steadier. Hope. The next morning, when he walked the girls to breakfast, people in the lobby recognized them. A barista smiled and said softly, "Coffee's on me, Mr. Reed." Maya tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, why do people keep looking at us?" Marcus knelt, met her eyes. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, the world needs to see what bravery looks like. And last night, it saw you." Outside, the sun was rising soft, gold, and forgiving. The story had escaped the walls of that airplane, but it had carried something bigger with it, the idea that decency still mattered, that dignity still spoke louder than hate, and that when one person stands quietly for what's right, the whole world might just start listening. When Flight 447 touched the ground at LAX, the landing was smoother than anyone expected. No turbulence, no applause. Just a long, steady roll down the runway, the sound of a story that had already taken on a life of its own. Inside the cabin, passengers were quiet. The hum of the engines blended with the soft sighs of relief. It wasn't the usual post-flight fatigue, it was reflection. Each person on that plane knew they'd been part of something larger than a flight. Marcus Reed didn't think about cameras, or headlines, or hashtags. He just thought about home, about the feeling of Naomi's hand in his, about his girls laughing in their kitchen back in Atlanta. He thought about how every moment of peace now felt like something he had to protect. Maya leaned over and whispered, "Daddy, are we here?" He smiled. "Yeah, sweetheart, we made it." Arya stretched in his arms, blinking awake. Isla rubbed her eyes and asked softly, "Is Grandma waiting?" Marcus nodded. "She's waiting. Baby, she always is." As the plane taxied to the gate, Captain Elena Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom one last time, calm, steady, carrying both command and compassion. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. On behalf of myself and the crew, I want to thank you for your patience and for reminding us that dignity still has a place in the sky. We wish you peace, wherever you're headed next." No one clapped, but for a brief, weightless moment, the silence itself felt like respect. The doors opened, and the first blast of California air hit warm, sharp, electric with noise. Marcus stepped out holding Aria, the twins following close behind. The sight that met them was overwhelming, a wall of flashing cameras, microphones, and reporters pressing forward behind ropes. Security officers guided passengers through narrow corridors, shouting for space. Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, over here. Can you tell us what really happened on Flight 447? Did you plan to sue? Do you believe this was racially motivated? The noise was deafening. Marcus shielded his daughters with his arm, his expression calm but firm. We'll speak when the time is right, he said softly. But not here. Not now. Behind him, Rachel Morrison was being escorted out of the aircraft by two uniformed staff members. Her once pristine uniform was wrinkled, her name tag turned upside down. The crowd turned their cameras toward her like a storm of light. Someone shouted. That's her, and the clicking of shutters grew frantic. Rachel didn't look up. She kept her head down, clutching her carry-on like a shield. Every flash felt like a judgment. To the media, she was a villain. To the company, a liability. But to Marcus, watching from a distance, she was something else entirely, a warning. A reminder of what happens when power forgets its purpose. He didn't feel triumph watching her go, just sadness. As he turned away, he murmured to himself, "Justice isn't about making someone small, it's about making something right." At the arrival gate, a woman stood waiting, small, silver-haired, but strong in the way that history makes people strong. Rose Williams, Naomi's mother, stood holding a handmade sign with 3 little hearts drawn on it. Maya, Isla, Aria, Grandma's Angels. The moment the girls saw her, they broke free and ran, laughter cutting through the chaos like music. Grandma Rose dropped the sign and opened her arms wide. The triplets collided into her, burying their faces in her shawl. She held them close, whispering each of their names like a prayer. "Oh, my babies, my beautiful girls, you're safe now." When she looked up at Marcus, her eyes filled pride, pain, and love all at once. "I saw the news," she said softly. "Your father would have been proud." Marcus's voice cracked. "I just did what you and Mama taught me. Keep your head when the world loses theirs." Rose smiled, touching his cheek. "And you showed your girls what real strength looks like. That's how we pass it on." Reporters kept snapping photos, but none of that mattered anymore. Rose guided the girls toward the car waiting outside, her movements slow but steady. The crowd parted instinctively, not because security demanded it, but because there was something sacred about the sight of a grandmother leading her family through the storm. One journalist whispered, "That's the image that'll stay with people, not the scandal, but this." And maybe they were right. Outside, the California sun hit bright and gold, the kind that made everything shimmer. Cameras flashed again as Marcus helped his daughters into the car. But this time, the light didn't feel invasive. It felt like closure. Daniel Thompson stood nearby, talking quietly to security officers. When he saw Marcus, he stepped forward. "We've got the legal team lined up," he said, "but take your time. Family first." Marcus nodded. "Thank you. For everything." Daniel smiled faintly. "You know, I used to think justice happened in courtrooms. Turns out, sometimes it starts in an airplane aisle." Marcus chuckled. "And sometimes it ends in a grandmother's hug." As the car pulled away, the noise of the terminal faded. Inside, the girls talked over one another, recounting the funny parts of the flight, the kind flight attendant, the ice cream, the captain's announcement. Children have a way of healing faster than the world deserves. Rose listened, smiling quietly, her hand resting on Marcus's. "You remember what I told you years ago? When Naomi first passed," she asked. Marcus nodded. "You said the best way to honor her was to keep walking forward. Rose looked out the window at the fading airport. You didn't just walk today, baby. You made the whole world stop and look. Later that night, when the family settled in at Rose's home in South Central Los Angeles, Marcus stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of jasmine from the neighbor's yard. The city lights stretched endlessly glowing, alive, imperfect, but beautiful. From inside, he could hear the girls giggling with their grandmother, the sound of dishes clinking, the rhythm of a home that had seen generations survive, endure, and rise. He whispered to himself, Naomi, we're okay. They're okay. That same moment, on television screens across the country, footage of their reunion aired. Commentators spoke about resilience, racial reckoning, a new conversation about power and respect. But for Marcus, the only headline that mattered was the one written in the quiet of his heart. We made it home with dignity intact. Morning came slow over Los Angeles, the kind of morning where the light doesn't rush in. It just seeps quietly through the blinds, soft and forgiving. Marcus Reed stood in his mother-in-law's kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold long before he realized it. The house was still except for the faint laughter of his daughters in the living room, playing a game with their grandmother. He watched them for a while, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time since that flight, the world felt still again. And yet, beneath that stillness, something was stirring, not anger, not revenge, something stronger, resolve. Later that day, his phone buzzed. A message from Daniel Thompson emergency board meeting. Noon. You should be there. Marcus stared at the screen for a moment, then smiled slightly. He didn't reply with words. Just a single thumbs-up emoji, something his daughters had taught him to use when words felt too heavy. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and kissed each girl on the forehead before heading out the door. Rose called after him, You go do what your heart knows, baby. Just remember, you're not fighting alone. I know, Marcus said softly. That's the point. The Skyreach Airlines headquarters looked different that day. Not physically, it was still glass and steel, polished and proud, but something in the air had changed. The usual hush of corporate confidence was gone, replaced by unease, the kind that fills a room when people realize they've been seen. When Marcus arrived, the receptionist looked up with a nervous smile. Mr. Reed, they're expecting you. He nodded. I figured they would. The boardroom was already full. Daniel at the head of the table, surrounded by executives, lawyers, and PR officers. The mood was sober, but not hostile. Daniel gestured toward an empty seat beside him. Marcus, glad you could make it. Marcus sat down quietly, setting a thick folder on the table. It was neatly labeled Systemic Bias and Accountability, Case 447. He didn't say a word. The label spoke for itself. Daniel stood first. You all know why we're here, he said evenly. Flight 447 wasn't just an incident. It was a revelation about how much work we still have to do. One executive muttered, It was one employee. Daniel's gaze sharpened. No. It was a culture that allowed one employee to think that kind of behavior was normal. The room went silent. Daniel turned to Marcus. You've spent your life fighting for justice. Help us make this right. Marcus opened the folder. Inside were photographs, witness statements, prior complaints, not just against Rachel Morrison, but patterns that had been ignored for years. These, Marcus said quietly, are the buried stories, the ones that didn't make the news because no one recorded them, the people who were told to move, to wait, to stop complaining until they gave up. He looked around the table. But giving up is no longer an option. A few heads lowered. One woman at the far end, the company's legal counsel, whispered, "So what do we do?" Marcus closed the folder and said, "We rebuild, not for optics, for truth." Daniel nodded. "We'll start by opening an independent review. We'll fund training, change our hiring process, and create a bias reporting system that actually protects people, not the brand." Then, he added, looking at Marcus, "And you'll help lead it." Marcus blinked, surprised. "You're serious?" Daniel smiled faintly. "You said it yourself. Policies don't change people. People change people. And you're one of those people." For a moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he nodded. "All right, let's make sure no one ever has to live through Flight 447 again." Outside the boardroom, cameras were already waiting. Word had spread that Skyreach was launching a civil rights initiative, and that Marcus Reed, the man at the heart of the Flight 447 story, would be its lead counsel. When he stepped out, microphones rushed toward him again. "Mr. Reed, are you suing the airline? Are you satisfied with the outcome? Do you forgive what happened?" Marcus paused at the top of the steps, the city wind tugging at his jacket. "I'm not here for revenge," he said calmly. "I'm here for reform. What happened to my daughters shouldn't happen to anyone's children on the ground or in the air. This isn't about punishment. It's about progress." Then, after a pause, "And forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's refusing to let hate dictate what comes next." That quote ran on every major news channel that night. People who'd seen anger everywhere suddenly saw something else, the power of restraint, of measured strength. Hashtags turned from outrage to inspiration. Flight 447 justice evolved into Wadi Stand with Dignity, a campaign encouraging people to speak out against discrimination while choosing grace over rage. Churches, schools, and community centers picked it up. Talk shows featured Marcus and Daniel side by side, unlikely allies united by the belief that justice and humility can coexist. And somewhere in Atlanta, Rose watched from her couch, tears in her eyes, whispering, "That boy's doing exactly what he was born to do." Weeks later, Marcus stood once again in a quiet courtroom, not to argue for damages, but to file the first motion in what he called the Systemic Justice Initiative. He wasn't suing a person, he was challenging a pattern. As he laid the documents before the clerk, he thought of Naomi, her voice, her strength, her endless faith that people could be better. He whispered under his breath, "We're still fighting. Love. But we're fighting smarter." That evening, back home in Atlanta, Marcus tucked his daughters into bed. Maya was already asleep, but Isla stirred, eyes half open. "Daddy," she murmured, "are bad people gone now?" Marcus smiled gently. "Not yet, baby, but they can't hide anymore." Arya yawned. "You're like a superhero, Daddy." Marcus chuckled. "No, sweetheart, I'm just a man who didn't stay quiet." He turned off the light, leaving the room in a soft golden glow. Outside, the night sky was clear, the kind of clarity that comes after a storm has done its work. The story of Flight 447 would go on to inspire hearings, documentaries, and corporate reforms. But for Marcus Reed, the real legacy wasn't written in headlines. It was written in the way his daughters now looked at the world, not with fear, but with faith. And maybe that's all justice really is, faith that light can still find its way through the cracks. The next day, Marcus recorded a short message for the public, something Daniel's PR team had requested, but that Marcus rewrote entirely in his own voice. "Every time you see injustice, you have a choice. You can look away, or you can stand. You don't have to shout. You don't have to fight dirty. You just have to stand with truth, with grace, with courage. Because silence, my friends, is where injustice grows. So next time you see it on a plane, in a store, in a meeting, don't ask, "Why should I get involved?" Ask, "What happens if I don't?" What happened on Flight 447 wasn't just a story about racism or injustice. It was a story about choice. The choice to stand tall when others try to make you small. The choice to use calm instead of chaos, dignity instead of rage. Marcus Reed didn't win that day because he shouted louder. He won because he stayed grounded, because he remembered that real power isn't in the voice that screams. It's in the voice that stays steady. His daughters didn't just survive humiliation, they witnessed what true strength looks like: a father who met hate with intelligence and turned pain into purpose. In a world that often rewards outrage, this story reminds us that restraint can be revolutionary. Justice doesn't always come with noise sometimes. It comes quietly, through persistence, patience, and faith in what's right. Maybe that's what we can all take with us from Flight 447. The courage to speak when it matters, the grace to listen when it's hard, and the wisdom to rise above those who try to drag us down. Because dignity, once defended, inspires others to do the same. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for caring about stories that remind us of our shared humanity. If this story moved you even just a little, please like, share, and subscribe. Every time you do, you help these stories travel a little farther, and maybe, just maybe, help someone else find the courage to stand tall when it's their turn.